After their victory at South Mountain, Union General McClellan with his Army of the Potomac was close on the heels of Confederate Generals Longstreet and Hill as they quickly retreated across Antietam Creek to set up a defensive line. After Union General Hooker crossed with the 1st Corps, it was up to 2 regiments of Pennsylvanians to find and probe Lee's vulnerable left flank. When darkness finally ended the brief skirmish, Union troops had pushed the Confederate forces away from the east woods, but both armies could barely sleep as skirmishing fire continued throughout the night. As the next morning dawned, however, the Confederate and Union troops stirred from their slumber for the action to come. The unending skirmish fire erupted further into proper battle as lines of infantry and batteries of artillery added to the cacophony. Just west of the east woods lies the cornfield owned by the Miller family, and by 6 o'clock on the morning of the 17th, the veteran troops of the Union Iron Brigade would advance from the north woods and through the cornfield into the open fields to their south, right into a withering fire. In the early morning hours of September 17th, various brigades of Union troops, including the recently famous Iron Brigade, would march from the North Woods and through the Miller family cornfield under heavy fire from rebel guns on Nicodemus Hill, and push the Confederate lines back from the open field beyond. However, every inch of ground was hotly contested, and Ewell's division of Confederates made sure the Federals paid for every rock and blade of grass they took over as the rebels retreated to the south and east across the Hagerstown Pike. The Federals would continue their drive towards the whitewashed Dunker Church, which became Hooker's goal for the Union 1st Corps to reach. But where General Hooker believed he was flanking the entire Confederate left, he was instead facing the staunch defense of 3 divisions who awaited the Federals' arrival with grim determination. On the Union side, Ricketts, Meade's, and Doubleday's division would march over 600 yards while slogging through heavy rebel fire to try and reach the church, but they would need to clear out the defenders along the pike first. Following their successful push southward from the cornfield, Union forces looked to secure Hagerstown Turnpike as well while they continued towards Dunker Church. Facing them were 2 Confederate brigades under Generals Stark and Taliaferro, the former of which included the fierce Louisiana Tigers. The Union's Iron Brigade would bash against their savage defense before the rebels were forced to retreat back to the West Woods to their southwest. However, unbeknownst to the Federal troops, even more Confederate forces were waiting under the shadowed boughs of the West Woods. The hungry and tired Texans, Georgians, and South Carolinians of Wolford's brigade who had set up some breakfast fires in the hope of a quick meal before battle, were instead roused by the orders of their officers back into their battle lines. Soon, they would march northward to the sounds of gunfire and screaming carnage on the other side of the chilly, shaded tree line, back towards a lonely cornfield that still had more death in store for its tilled ground. With a sudden and shrill explosion of devilish voices, Hood's division burst from the west woods and headed northeast, rapidly pushing the Yankees back across the Hagerstown Turnpike and then north through the Miller cornfield in a wild onrush of Gray and Butternut. Wolford's Confederate brigade would almost reach the northern boundary of that cornfield in their advance, but they extended too far and became flanked on three sides by artillery and infantry, which cut man and cornstalk down in equal measure in a hail of lead and smoke. As the fighting occurred in the cornfields to the west, in the east woods which partially bordered the cornfield, Law's brigade advanced into their abandoned forward outposts from the previous night. But in a turn of fate, it was now they who would be matched by a furious charge by the Yankees in blue, as the entire 12th Corps under the aged General Mansfield met them head-on. Ohioans and Pennsylvanians would once again clash with their Confederate counterparts as even more support from Garland's North Carolinian brigade joined the fray. Approximately 20 minutes after beginning their push from the west woods, most of Law's brigade were able to get through the woods with only the paltry defense lent by the 10th Maine to stop them. However, down the Smoketown Road came General Mansfield, who rode at the head of over 8,000 men of the 12th Corps, though the general would be shot in the chest by rebel sharpshooters as he surveyed the situation. Yet his corps would continue to advance inexorably southward, also with the church and the bellowing rebel cannons in front of it as their target, while shattering Law's rebel lines before them. Farther to the northwest, for 2 hours, rebel gunners positioned on Nicodemus Hill had been able to bombard the flanks of the Yankee forces below them. But if General Hooker had decided to silence their guns once and for all, then an attack would likely have been launched from the Miller Farm by the men of Doubleday's division, as Confederate elements of both infantry and Jackson's brash cavalry attempted to defend their guns from the Union advance. The Nicodemus farmstead suffered little structural damage during the battle, despite the immense amount of shells which screamed a deathly whine above it from the exchanges of counter-battery fire between the Confederates on Nicodemus Hill and the Union artillery stationed en masse at the Joseph Poffenberger farm just above the North Woods. But for the women and children which had briefly taken refuge in the Nicodemus farmhouse prior to the battle's starting, few wished to remain to find out if an errant shell might crash towards them instead. However, during the battle, General McClellan placed a higher emphasis on pushing south towards the town of Sharpsburg. While the 1st and 12th Corps were gaining ground again down the Hagerstown Pike and from the East Woods, it was Sumner's 2nd Corps of Lincolnites that were next to enter the fray. Yet awaiting them were 3 understrength brigades of Confederates in an old sunken farming road, which would soon become an open grave for thousands of bodies, and would be known as Bloody Lane. As morning turned to afternoon, a sunken farming lane southeast of Countercharge, which served local farmers to get their grain to the various mills along Antietam Creek, also equally served as an already dug trench line for the ragged Confederate infantry that made up the entire center of Lee's overstretched lines. Despite inflicting terrible losses on several brigades of Green Union troops, the Confederates inevitably broke and ran to the thin reserves holding at General Longstreet's headquarters at the Piper Farm, where Longstreet and his staff themselves were forced to man a cannon to cover their retreat and attempt to hold the line. The exhausted Union forces weren't able to push their advantage against the weakened center, as the battle instead shifted further west towards Countercharge. Still more troops, clad in blue, were streaming across Antietam Creek at various bridges and fords, several points of which were hotly contested as they attempted the crossing. This included the Middle Bridge, where the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry and several regular regiments of the U.S. Army were grouped together and pushing directly west towards Sharpsburg, though it was at the cost of lives such as Colonel Childs, who was gutted by a cannonball, likely from one of H.P. Jones's guns. The idyllic Antietam Creek was an important waterway which powered a number of grist mills for the wheat and corn grown in the area. It was also a natural barrier between the two armies as they met for battle. Thus, one of the logistical and strategic hurdles for General McClellan to consider was how to get tens of thousands of men, horses, and cannon across in time to engage against Confederates. On the 16th, rebel pickets spotted the first elements of the 1st Corps crossing at Pry Ford and the Upper Bridge, with more moving across during the night and the next morning. Of course, not all actions could be done with impunity, and some light skirmishes occurred on both days as the armies vied against each other. Besides the fords and bridges, otherwise mundane structures could become important strategic buildings and defensive points, as was the case with one of the grist mills owned by the Pry family. More blood would be spilt here in the fateful days during and after the battle, but this time by more friendly and caring hands. The Pry Grist Mill had originally been built in 1820 by Samuel Hitt with 2 stories, and even diverted the main road to specifically pass by. 2 years after it was purchased by the Pry brothers, in 1850 a fire burned down the wooden upper story, which they replaced with brick and built even higher. During the Battle of Antietam, it was chosen by General McClellan's medical director, Major Jonathan Letterman, as one of 7 field hospitals as part of the new system he had devised and implemented the previous month to treat the immense amount of wounded that would quickly fill the fields and forests around the mill. The Pry family was hit hard by the exigencies of war, though Samuel Pry, who owned the mill, was able to get by much better than his brother Philip, whose entire farm was taken over as a combination of Union headquarters, hospital, and artillery park, causing thousands of dollars in damages. The quiet life that Philip and his wife Elizabeth had built, along with their 5 children, would soon be turned upside down as soldiers, horses, and wagons streamed through by the thousands towards a deadly confrontation. Philip Pry had built his farm with the help of his brother Samuel from the ground up in 1844. But 20 quiet years meant little to the army that needed to bend the land to their needs. With its commanding view over much of the prospective battlefield to the west, General McClellan and his staff were quick to make use of the western overlook and even the attic roof access hatch to survey the battlefield and divvy out orders. The house and barn were also convenient field hospital and headquarters of Major Letterman, the medical director for the Army of the Potomac. His revamping of the entire medical corps, which he had conceived the month prior, would be put to the test with the immense amount of wounded that would result from the battle. More yet were sure to come as Union forces headed next into the West Woods, a disjointed polygon of woodland that divided the old Mary Grove Locker land tract and the Mumma and Miller farms. The Union 2nd Corps under General Edwin Sumner had crossed over Antietam Creek and joined the fray. But as they marched toward the burning Mumma farm, Sedgwick's 2nd Division suddenly became isolated when General French became confused on which direction to go and mistakenly took his division south, leaving Sedgwick vulnerable and alone as the trees enveloped his men, many to never return. Within an hour of their foray into the West Woods, Sedgwick was riddled with bullets in his wrist, leg, and shoulder, and the units he led were almost completely halved as the division suffered over 2,200 casualties. General Sumner was forced to personally lead his shattered 2nd Division out of the West Woods and to the north to escape the deadly fire of their Confederate rivals of Walker and McLaw's brigades, who had just returned from the siege of Harper's Ferry. The remaining troops and guns of the 1st Corps helped prevent a complete slaughter or capture of Sedgwick's division as they retreated back towards the Miller farm. But neither of the exhausted sides were interested in continuing the fight in the northern part of the battlefield. As the noonday sun crested in the sky, a fresh division under General Greene of Mansfield's 12th Corps had arrived through the East Woods to finish the work of their predecessors, and would soon feel the buzzing of shot and shell about them as the church loomed. Despite taking elevated casualties due to deploying to the field initially in a column formation while in easy range of rebel guns, the Union troops ably pressed on. They marched directly towards the particular guns of Captain Henry Carleton, which awaited the Yankees like a hungry maw. The Dunkers were but one subset of the many Protestant offshoots which resulted from the Reformation, named after their full dunking of a person during a baptism. Many of the adherents had fled to the United States in the decade following their founding in 1708, and in 1851 the Mumma family had donated a portion of their land for the church to be built upon. Its whitewashed walls would serve as an easy landmark for commanders to guide to as the tide of blue finally marched past it and into the woods beyond. A gargantuan amount of casualties would be gathered here as the church was used as an aid station, and a truce would be called on the 18th to gather the wounded and bury the many dead. Greene's division managed to make it halfway through the West Woods before their momentum dried up. Instead, they set up a defensive salient against any possible counterattack. But the next main action to arrive would be farther south, at the lower bridge over the Antietam Creek. General Burnside, in command of the 9th Corps, had taken the majority of the day to set up his attack, and at 10 o'clock finally received the orders from General McClellan to advance. Guarding the bridge were 2 batteries and the Georgians under General Robert Toombs. They were all that stood between Sharpsburg and the entire Union 9th Corps, which would send wave after wave of regiments to attack the bottleneck at the bridge. After many hours of fighting, the tenacious Georgian defenders that had dug in on the hillside overlooking the old Rohrbach Bridge had managed to almost hold out with only a fraction of the numbers sent against them. But it was the twin regiments of the 51st New York and 51st Pennsylvania that finally managed to push across. As reports came to General Toombs of Union forces from Rodman's division also crossing at Snavely's Ford to the southwest, Toombs had to make a galling decision lest he be overrun. The Confederates finally were forced back towards Sharpsburg, though it would take even more precious time for General Burnside to get his forces across the Antietam. As men and guns funneled across the bridge, farther north the battlefield would briefly heat up once again, as General Greene with his battered division of bluecoats became uneasy as no reinforcements arrived to help hold his advanced position west of Countercharge. His unease became justified as a horde of screaming Confederates pushed him and his men out of the woods and back across the open fields to the east. While most of the Confederate forces preferred to stay under the protective cover of the tree line rather than face the many Federal guns shooting at them, 2 regiments under the inexperienced Colonel Cooke advanced almost to the charred doorstep of the Muma farmhouse once again. Seeing a possible advantage, Colonel Cooke had his men rise up from behind the fence line they had been sheltering at, and advanced into the open towards the Muma farm with the expectation that the other regiments positioned in the West Woods would push with them. Instead, the 2 regiments went forward alone to face the entire Union 6th Corps. However, they managed to surprise and capture a large number of Yankees in their wild onrush as the other Union regiments fell back past the orchard behind the smoldering Muma farmhouse. This meant the Union regiments near the sunken lane were then in danger of being flanked from behind. Yet as these events occurred, more fighting also occurred farther south, as General Burnside attempted to consolidate his position on the other side of the Antietam Creek. The 9th Corps were forced to clamber up the steep hillside that had been pockmarked with various foxholes and fighting pits before reaching the summit, where the Otto and Sherrick farms stood. There, the Federals skirmished with the patchwork of small rebel regiments that attempted to hold back this latest threat, one that could possibly cut the entire army off from their only avenue of escape. In 1831, the widow Margaret Hams sold her Mount Pleasant property in 2 lots, one to Joseph Sherrick and the other to John Otto, who became fellow neighbors and parishioners at Countercharge farther north. The Otto family even donated the bricks for the building of it, while Joseph Sherrick, Samuel Muma, and Daniel Miller supervised its construction. But these picturesque farms would soon be inundated by soldiers and death, with most every scrap of food taken and the farms used as hospitals once the battle had shifted past them. Thankfully, the $3,000 in gold Joseph Sherrick hid in one stone wall was still there when they had the chance to return afterward. However, with the continued advancement of Cooke's troops towards the Muma farm farther north, it meant the troops closer to the sunken lane suddenly had enemies to their rear. It forced the bloodied and exhausted members of Kimball's brigade to about face and move to find defensive positions along Roulette Lane near the Clip and Roulette farms. The cornfields to their new front were teeming with rebels that had already wreaked havoc among several Union regiments as they charged pell-mell across the open fields between the Countercharge and Muma farm. Here, the Union regiments would attempt to hold off against this last-ditch effort by the Confederates as devilish cries reached their ears. The area that was the Roulette Farm had originally been owned by the Miller family before the death of John Miller IV, whose widow Anne would sell it to her stepsister's husband, a gentleman named William Roulette. This farm would soon be subject to the ebb and flow of battle as William hid in the basement from the conflict that ravaged the house above him. Yet even with having the advantage of surprise, there was little that two lonesome Confederate regiments could do when faced against an entire corps worth of Union combatants that surrounded them on three sides. Once again, Cooke's command was forced to retreat as a hail of bullets followed them in their wake. As Cooke and his men retreated, he was in part followed by a brigade of mainly New Yorkers and one small battalion from Maine, all under the command of Colonel William Irwin, who would on 5 occasions be accused of being a habitual drunkard. After a desultory and failed advance against the Confederates in the West Woods, by 4 p.m. the men of Irwin's brigade had found what cover they could in the swales of the open ground between Dunker Church and the burned Muma Farm. Yet as fire from sharpshooters and Confederate guns alike whistled and screamed over their heads, Irwin would give a command that would prove disastrous to the understrength 7th Maine. In response to harassing sharpshooter fire coming from the apple orchard near the Piper Farm, the 7th Maine, under command of Major Thomas Hyde, was ordered to clear the sharpshooters out. Hyde was confused by Colonel Irwin's orders, considering the obvious presence of a considerable number of rebels dug in around the farm just behind the orchard, and the 7th Maine barely had 181 men to its roster. Despite this, they advanced, and all alone they successfully managed to clear out the sharpshooters. But they were caught in a deadly crossfire that, even despite the expert maneuvers by Major Hyde to help his troops avoid the worst of it, would result in less than 70 managing to make it back to friendly lines. Colonel Irwin would be removed from command shortly after. This last bit of fighting in the northern part of the battlefield, which had been advised more by John Barleycorn than by sensible military tactics, was shortly followed by one last surprise General Lee still had left to play for the battle. Far to the southwest, General A.P. Hill and his light division had been left behind in Harper's Ferry to parole the 15,000 Union prisoners taken in the siege, and by late afternoon had finally arrived to help the endangered southern flank of Lee's line. His troops, then clad in part with captured Union uniforms, would serve as a nasty surprise on the left flank of General Burnside's 9th Corps as they attempted to assault Sharpsburg. It would be a bloody revelation for several New Englander regiments. At close to 5 in the afternoon, the signal station at Elk Mountain sent a dire warning to the signalman located at General Burnside's headquarters at the Rohrbach Farm to look well on his left, for A.P. Hill's light division had arrived to reinforce the Confederate right. Where the 9th Corps had managed to almost reach the outskirts of Sharpsburg, they were instead forced back to the ridgeline overlooking Antietam Creek due to the sudden onslaught. While some preparation had been made, the sheer force of Carolinian infantry and batteries of artillery were too much to bear for the tired Union forces, and with the retreat, it was the end of the battle as the evening light closed on the bloodiest single day of the war. Over the course of a few hours, almost 23,000 men would be dead, wounded, or missing from the Battle of Antietam. Following a brief truce to collect the wounded and bury the dead on the 18th, General McClellan expected further battle to take place, only for General Lee to leave his campfires burning overnight as his army slipped away to cross the Potomac at Shepherdstown. While some elements said to find the Army of Northern Virginia would eventually engage his vanguard on the 19th and 20th there, Lee was still able to retreat back into Confederate territory. Antietam was proclaimed a Union victory, and enough of one that President Lincoln could announce plans that for all those living in bondage in the rebellious states, henceforward shall be free. Yet the war would continue on for another grueling 3 years, and this hard-fought battlefield, its streams, hillocks, and woods, would not be the last.